birth is so triggered, right? Like you get to sink into your body and you get to realize that right now in this moment, there's over 8 billion people on the planet. And every single one of those people had to be born.
What's up, beautiful awakened beings? Welcome to another episode of Awakened Love. Today we have midwife Lindsey Meehlies, who for the past 20 years has worked in healthcare, but has found herself working in the shadows of the night, helping women discover their own strength through psychedelic, transcendent experiences while they birth their babies in power at home. Now, she is trained traditionally and licensed through the medical board, but quickly learned that what is needed in the magic and mystery of birth and death cannot be found in a book. I'm so grateful to be exploring that magic and mystery of birth with her today. And so we're going to dive right in. So we were just talking before hitting record and things were getting so good that I was like, hold on, Lindsey, hold that thought. I need to hit record. So I want to backtrack a little bit. We were talking about how both of us have experienced trolls online and how, you know, when you expand your reach, that can happen. And I said that I had this conversation with Spirit after being on the Mark Hyman podcast about me wanting to crawl into a hole and hide and just not be super visible and just do my work quietly on this mountaintop. And Spirit said to me, you know, are you willing to be crucified in the name of this work? Like, are you really willing to carry this work? And I said, oh boy, yes. And you were sharing about the word crucifixion, and I'll let you dive off from there.
Yeah. So I was just sharing, like, I too am in this situation where with more public exposure, we have this like deep sense of where we actually need to step into what it is to be crucified. And I love the history of it. It's one of the things I'm super passionate about learning more about. And there's so much literature out there. None of it agrees with each other. It's so repressed. Everything's so hidden. But what we do know is in 1484, there was a book that was written called The Witch's Hammer. And the Witch's Hammer came and they basically said that the greatest threat to the Catholic Church is midwives. And so throughout all of time, but specifically from that date forward, any woman that has spoken out against anything that's against what the like politics of that current theme and era is, we have to make that decision to potentially be crucified. And it's something that's really hard for women to accept because there's such deep sister wounds within all of the lineages of women that have come before us because of the threat of death. And not even just the threat of death, but like watching our children die or, you know, being separated from and outcast from our community. And it's something that's really, really hard to get past. And, I remember reading something that Joe Rogan wrote once, and he was like, never read the comments, never read the comments. And it's something that's so hard for me that I come from a place of being fully heart-centered, and everything that I say, I want women to feel empowered and not shamed by. And so when you have these trolls that come into the internet space and you're like, this is not my message and this is not my authentic truth, but you're saying that's what it is. So I'm going to let you stay in your projection and I'm going to stay over here and not read the comments.
Yep. Don't read the comments, people. That is the truth. And it's tricky, right? Like I had a really good friend of mine say this to me and I was like, oof. And he was like, he has a lot more exposure than I do. And thankfully I have quite a few friends that I could go to that have far more exposure. And they were like, oh, honey, even my husband, he was like, babe, when he started his YouTube channel, or he was like the face of HelloFresh in the UK, he's like, people, you should read the shit that people have said about me.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh Lord. And everyone was like, yeah, one, don't read the comments. But my other friend said this interesting thing. He was like, look, if there's any, like, see if you can actually be in the state of consciousness where it's like, is there any truth to that? Mm-hmm. Some of them are just like super mean and highly unnecessary, or as you said, distortions, projections. And you're like, well, that's not necessary. But he's like, you know, you don't need to keep reading, but any of the things that you read, does any of it like ring true, or is any of it playing on insecurities that you have?
Of course. You know?
That's
like a really huge thing, because then you get to breathe into your trigger.
Yeah. And you're like, oh shit, I'm worried people think that about me, or I'm worried, like, at least for me, that I was like, oh man, like, okay, That's good for me to see. Like I said to you, I was kind of used to people just being like, yay, angel. And I was like, well, this is really good for me. This is really good for my ego. But then there's the other parts that are not constructive. But anyways, I want to dive into what you were talking about around the fact that so midwives were really connected to the witch trials, would you say? Like, what's
they
up with
were
that?
the heart and soul of the witch trials. And it's something that's just not talked about a lot. And if you look at it, so basically when men in the space, men and women, they all turned on each other, came into the space of thinking of all this magic and mystery that surrounded what women are. You know, like one of the most important things that they started looking at is that we bleed and we don't die. And so that just in itself was like, how do these creatures, how do these women bleed and not die? And so everything started circling around that. And then they started coming into this space where Western medicine moved in. And it wasn't the herbs that, you know, were grown in the local town. And it wasn't the ability to, you make like an onion poultice to put on someone's feet. Like it was literally like healing had to come from a higher source. Now, trust me, I so believe in the power of prayer. I think the power of prayer is such an important aspect to any healing. But it really got villainized that these earth workers, that these midwives, these women that were ostracized for creating healing within communities were literally burned at the stake in front of their families, in front of their children. And women would turn against women and turn other women in. And, you know, even men in the community, if they had sexual attraction towards another woman, then it was on the woman, not the man. Like, God forbid the man have the feeling that what they were thinking was, you know, wrong. And it was because that woman had magical powers that lured them in. Oof. And so there's just so much to deep dive into. And there was millions of women killed during that time. Like it was literally like an entire like memory, all the stories, all of that important history, which I call herstory, was just plucked away. And so another piece of the conversation that we were having before we hit record is that whenever women see undisturbed, normal physiological birth, there's usually this really innate feeling that comes out like as this effervescent emotion. And, you know, it's because we say 7 generations back is what we remember in our bones from our ancestors. And so 7 generations, like that was like in the middle of all of this. This was our great grandmas that were in the middle of this in Europe. And that's just what we have written literature of, like it for sure was before. But in the beginnings of that patriarchy, it was eliminating the magic and the mystery that were created by women sitting in circles together, by sitting in circles of women bleeding together in their red tents. At that point, it was dangerous to be a woman.
Yeah, I've heard that, and I don't know whether you've heard this too, but that not only were the midwives or the wisdom carriers killed, but their sisters, their mothers, and their daughters. Yeah, to truly try to extinguish the knowledge, essentially. And what's so sad is that we see that repeated, right? We see that repeated in colonial massacres where they try to take First Nations people and destroy their ability to keep telling their stories and to pass their wisdom down. So it's not, sadly, this is, we have examples of when people feel threatened by something they don't understand and how they try to extinguish it. It's actually interesting because I look at kind of the divide that we have today.
Yeah, that was what I was just going to say. Such a division today. Playing it out. It's still playing. We're not like burning women at the stake in the public town centers, but like cancel culture. The huge division that we have in this country and across the world, like politically speaking, like it's all to divide us and make us not remember that we're all the same. Like we all come from the womb of a woman. We are all birthed. We all have a heart. We all start with this pure beginning. And once we step into that division, that's when people become addicts and there's trauma and there's abuse and there's all these other things. So we're still in the middle of this witch hunt, if you will, but just in a different capacity.
Yes, especially I noticed, particularly during COVID, I know it's so boring, we don't want to talk about it, but just as far as like the divide in the medical kind of in the way that we perceive medical care and, natural physicians or functional medicine physicians or natural birth facilitators or anyone who kind of took a stand for the body as a holistic system that has the capacity to heal that sometimes needs to be supported, I saw got super vilified. It was really interesting. And I think that it all comes from fear, right? And I can understand this from my own sort of family dynamic. And I was back in Australia, I think probably 2 years ago now, and towards the end of a good family holiday with my husband, the first time in Australia. And I'm like, oh, this is amazing. This has gone so well. There's been no arguments. How fantastic. And right towards the end of the trip, something came up about when Patrick and I have children and some kind of a thing. And I made a comment. I was like, well, I won't be in hospital. I'll be at home. And my parents and my husband both got super triggered. And I didn't realize that we all had such differing opinions. And I could feel they were scared for me. They were scared, but I am scared to be in a hospital. If I can avoid it, I'm scared of what will happen to me there. And so I can kind of see that like I have this fear and they have this fear and it's just manifesting in different ways. And do you see that in the work that you do? And how do you suggest we bridge that divide if we have different fears?
Yeah. So fear is a really, really big one. And that's usually from like propaganda that comes out from just misinformation. It's not like they're like, oh my gosh, you're crazy. It's literally like they just don't have the information that's needed in order to say like, that's actually a really safe alternative. And within the medical community, not only is it fear-based, but it's liability-based. And then there's the vilification of basically a mafia, if you will, of big farm that's coming in and making billions of dollars on people. And I'm not anti-medicine. Like I am the last person that's anti-medicine. It's a crucial part of how we survive. But when you have a machine that is making billions of dollars off the heads of sick people every single year, then we're going to have this push because it's just human nature. It's like they've created a monopoly on our health. And so that weaves into the childbirth system because when you look at even how the insurance companies are run, the insurance companies are in bed with all of the major American Medical Association, the FDA, all of those things. And when you have those things connected, then what happens is if I have somebody that's coming to me to give birth and the actual cost of them to give birth in the hospital ranges anywhere from, let's say, $18,000 to if they had a C-section all the way up to $50,000. When they come to me, I don't take insurance. I'm all cash pay. So you have somebody that's looking at, if I go to the hospital, it's free. And the insurance companies will cover my expense. Or if I want something that's different, I'm coming about $10,000 out of pocket. Maybe my insurance will reimburse me a little bit. But usually that's a big price tag for people to make the commitment to as they're starting a family or expanding their family. So there's so many interwoven layers, but they're all connected. And it's all about having control over this beast of a medical society, this community that is so divided. And it's so interesting because I've been in the medical field since I was 17. So I've watched so much of it change and evolve over time. And 2020 was like actual insanity. Like what is happening? How is this real life? Like, how have we gone this far and now we're like set back another, 50 years? And then to watch the childbirth system change so much. Like we were at a point in 2020 where women weren't even being allowed partners to come in and give birth with them. Like that's crazy. Like all this progressiveness around our femininity and this, like whole women's movement, like overnight gone. And so, we were loud enough to, get some stuff moved and shaked within that. But like, I have a friend right now that works in the hospital system. I like fully stepped out of the hospital system unless I, of course, have to transfer somebody in, which is really rare. That she says like every time that she steps into the hospital as a doula, supporting a woman giving birth at the hospital, she feels like she's going to war. And I would echo that. And again,
Yes.
this is not an anti-hospital message. It's just that now we have post-2020, we have healthcare providers that are burnt the hell out. There's so much division even within the systems within the hospital of now looking at what's happened and having a complete distrust for the information that we were told. And everybody's just spinning their wheels. And so this is not how anybody should be entering into giving birth. This is not how anybody should be entering through a pregnancy where we're growing a new life and we're basically this garden for this soul that's growing. It needs to be this like rich, fertile soil that we're growing them in. And if you're in this fear-based system, it's like getting sprayed with a weed killer every time. And so there needs to be this huge flip. And I feel like people are waking up. We know they are. They're 2020, if you compare statistics between 2019 and 2020 with home birth increased 22%. And it's not that home birth is 22% of the births. There was just a 22% increase within the home birth community. My husband actually owns a birth kit company where we have women that order birth kits in order for them to give birth at home. It's different midwife supplies. In March, it was like actual insanity. Like we're like March of 2020. We're like, what is happening? Like nobody's going to give birth at home or give birth in the hospital anymore because nobody's desiring to be there. So it's been so interesting to step back as someone that's been in this for, 20 plus years and be like, okay, like what's going to happen next now, people?
Yes. I think it was what I noticed is like, I just had questions and I was like, why aren't I allowed to have questions?
Yeah.
That's when I start to get concerned. If anyone who's critically thinking and saying, because I was pretty early starting to say, this doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And at first my husband was like, stop it. You're going down a rabbit hole. And I was like, no, I'm not actually. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. I don't know what's happening, but it's not adding up. Mm-hmm. And I started to present the information to him and he was like, that doesn't add up. You're right. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it was really hard because it felt like we weren't allowed to ask questions. And even amongst friends and people you love, it's just like people were scared. And people want to believe that when things are really hard and scary, that we can trust our government, that we can trust the protection agencies, the medical system, the pharma system, our
which
food
is very,
system.
very strategic, right? Like they know that. Like that's something that is all part of this is that they know if there's fear that people just blindly trust, like ignorance is bliss. And so people like me and you who have this remembering that's not like so deeply buried within our bodies, like, I mean, I think for the first week of it, it was kind of like a shock and awe. Like, what the hell is going on? Is this real? Or like, is this, are people really going to start dropping dead? I remember like videos of people dropping dead in the streets of China. And I'm like, oh God, can you imagine if that happens here? And then like, I did one birth in a mask, one. And after that birth, I was like, there's no human connection here. I will never do that again. I don't even care. Like, I will risk my life so women can feel loved and supported. And within that like week period, I was like, same, like something's not adding up. Like we're losing our autonomy at rapid speeds right here. Like what is going on? Like I remember from, 6 generations back or whatever it was in my lineage that like this same crap happened.
Yes. Yeah, we have to be able to ask questions. That's what I would say to anyone listening who is feeling, let's say, triggered right now. Probably not if you're listening to this podcast, chances are.
Yeah. But if you are, like
then maybe.
Yeah, but also I encourage you guys to take a deep breath into that. Yeah. Like that's such a huge thing. Like it's so important for us to like, if we're like, holy, what are these crazy people saying? But like really and truthfully, like, deep within your soul, the truth.
Yes. And it's worth questioning. I would just 100%. Say, just be in the curiosity. And if anyone is trying to stop you from having questions, it's okay if people have different answers to your answers, but if someone's trying to stop you from asking a question, I'm like a hell no to that. That in my body is like, I would die for the right to ask a question.
Yeah.
So like we can have different answers. That's all good. But to ask questions has to be okay. And I think that around birth, particularly, there isn't a lot of room sometimes in the Western model to ask questions for women. I haven't given birth, but from I was telling you before we hit record, you were like, how did you find me? And I was like, on Instagram, I get lost in these holes of natural birth. I don't know why. It's one of my little quirks. And I was telling you, I get super emotional watching women give birth. And, I've read a lot of women's stories around this, and I hear that, and it's not every story. Some women have great hospital births, but other women feel not listened to, like they can't ask questions, like they don't have time for them. And so I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest lie that we've been sold about birth?
That birth is an emergency that we need to be rescued from, hands down.
Oof.
That's the basis of what's taught in obstetrical care. That's in the textbooks. Like, there is an obstetrical model of care that literally says that this is an emergency that we need to save women from. And so if we enter as a healthcare provider into that immediately makes me a savior. And that immediately takes my ego thinking that I know what's better for someone's body than what they know. And so when I have women that enter into my space in my office, the first thing that I do is I sit them down, and like, our office is really sweet. It's like this super family friendly space, and it feels like a home. And I start by saying, I want you to know that I inherently trust that you are the expert in your own body. I will always be here with you, but I want you to know that if you ask me for advice, I'll give you what my experience and my knowledge is, but I will always end it by asking, how does that feel to you? Because that's the most important piece. And I promise you, like, I mean, my whole life is intuition based. I live life through my intuition. And so I'm usually on the same page with a lot of women, most of my clients, but they know. Like, they know their bodies, they know their babies. And for us to assume otherwise is insanity.
Yeah, it's so wild that, like, someone's telling you what to do and when to do it when they're not inside your body having the lived feeling experience, instead of teaching women, I imagine, like, when you feel this inside your body, you're going to know. And what that could mean is this, like, wow, imagine even just listening, like, not just in birth care, but imagine just in, like, healthcare in general, if people listened to you and actually believed you about the symptoms or the experiences that you're having. So my husband has a lot of questions, and I think this could be interesting for anyone who, let's say they do know and they are like, I would want to have a home birth, but I'm scared. Yeah. And I think, my husband's line of questioning might be good from that perspective, because he's kind of like, I'm willing to be convinced, but the way that he sees it right now and what he says to me is, he's like, you are the most important thing in my life. Of course. And if you're carrying our child, you are now carrying, you are, and you have within you my whole world. And so his fear is like, he's like, I can't even risk that. He's like, I could never live with myself. He's like, he's in that. And he's also like, and I'm willing to have my mind changed. So for anyone listening, and maybe if you have a partner that feels the same way I do, yeah, we could answer these questions, and then you can share this podcast with them. So how does that feel?
I love that. I think it's so perfect. And I think it's something that if you really take a step back and look throughout time, like, my biggest thing is great grandma wisdom. Like, what would our cave grandmas do? And for all of time, men have been our protectors. Right? So they would be the ones outside the cave, making sure that there was no threat of danger. There was no lion or whatever approaching the cave. And that's what their job was protection. So now, I mean, I know there's people that still have the threat of lions in our world, but for the majority of people living in the Western world, that is not our threat system. And so men have now transferred that to saying, like, it's my job to protect you. You're the most important person in my life. I would never want anything to happen to you. So I would probably say, like, 95% of men come into my office super, like, I'm only here because of my wife. Like, I don't want, like, if this is her idea, 100%, I don't think it's a good idea. And I'm like, you're my favorite. You are my favorite. Because what you're going to realize is that you have the ability to protect your wife in such a deeper level. Because when men enter into a medical system where there are no options and care is dictated, basically, I've had many dads say to me that what it felt like was watching their wives be raped without being able to do anything. right? Like it's because it's medical care. It's from a doctor. It's standard of care. You're not supposed to question these things. But the innate imprint that left on their psyche was that somebody was violating their wife and they could not do it. And I had that same experience so many times when I worked in the hospital. I felt like an accomplice to a crime. And the healthcare providers aren't doing it in a sense where they want to violate women and make that sensation be felt. It's the way that they're trained. It's the way that medical school is. It's just how care is assumed and given to others. It's not because they're bad people. It's because of how their training was. So when these husbands realize like, okay, now I actually get to be in my own domain, like this is my own sacred space that we've created together. And the person that's entering into my house to help my wife give birth has been through the entire process of pregnancy. She's my wife's dear friend at this point. She knows everything about her body. Like she's learned her body over the course of the last 10 moons. She's learned the baby and what's normal for the baby over the course of that last 40 weeks. And she's entering into this space lovingly and wanting to provide an experience that's transformative. And I'm speaking for myself. Not all midwives are created equal, but I know that there is a lot of midwives that provide the same sort of level of care that I give. And so then the man goes, oh, okay. This is safer. And home birth is not for everybody. If you enter into this as a high risk in terms of like health conditions, like if you have like cardiac problems or like, seizures or something like that, like home birth's not for you. There's a reason that the hospital's there. There's a reason that there's higher level of care providers there. But for a normal low risk woman, the physiological process that happens at a home birth is so much safer when it's provided at home. And there's so many studies that say opposite, but if you look at like European nations or like Japan or like anybody that actually has midwives at the forefront of care and is pro midwife, it's because it's thousands and thousands and thousands of people, where here we aren't well supported in the system. Like going to a hospital is awful. I don't care. I'll go in no matter what if we need to go to the hospital. But there is such an issue with receiving like what's called a home birth transfer, that there's so many midwives that are like resistant, like, oh, I don't know if it's time to go in yet. I don't know if it's time to go in yet. And it's because of this animosity that's between care providers, where my biggest thing is like, bridge the gap. If you don't like me, that's fine. If you don't like what they're doing, that's fine. But I did not hold a gun to her head and keep her at home. This was an informed decision. This is something that is really important that we identify that she made her own decision to give birth at home. And if you actually look at the level of education of people that are giving birth at home, it's usually all higher education. It's usually people that are in the higher income brackets. It's, like people that are really doing this research. I also try to have an outreach within the community where like, let me give you the data. Let me show you, like firefighters. If I activate EMS, let me tell you what a midwife is and what we actually have the capacity to do. Because you coming into the space, if I need you, would be like you coming onto the scene of somebody having a heart attack and having a cardiologist there. I'm just using you as a ride to the hospital because we need a higher level of care. So there's just so many facets to it. But like once men like sink into that and they realize the level of safety and like individualized care that's there, it feels so different, like immediately. And then they can go into all these other things, which I'm sure you'll ask me, but that's the biggest piece right there.
Yeah. And it was interesting, like hearing you talk about how with your midwifery practice, there's this intention, like you're getting to know a woman's body over 10 moons. And I imagine that previously that would have been how it was done. Like it would be your mother or your grandmother or the midwife of the community that knows you and knows your body. And granted, I don't want to romanticize it. Like childbirth used to be very dangerous for women. Like, yes, that was very true.
It's still dangerous. Like the level of care that's given, especially within the United States. I know that sounds crazy because like the United States is like the forefront of Western medicine. Like women and children's, or babies, I should say, still die every single day in childbirth. So there is this innate fear that we have within ourselves because throughout time, like it is something that can be dangerous when the right level of care isn't given. And so that's something that people need to take a step back and realize is like, but why? Like, but why? Is it because they're not a trusted caregiver there that has known this woman from the beginning of her menstruation or from the beginning of her conception journey? And like, what does that look like? And maybe the things that we're doing, like, like maybe the rate of infection after a C-section being so much higher is causing a lot of problems, or maybe because of the levels of nutrition and the quality of nutrition and the depleted soil that we have within our systems that's not giving these babies enough nutrients and minerals to, have good outcomes. There's so many questions that should be asked, because we should be leading the level of infant and mortality care. And we are like abysmal, like bad, like one of the worst in westernized worlds.
Yes. So I'm recognizing in this moment, I feel scared.
Yeah. Good.
And anyone listening might feel scared. So I want to name that. And I also don't want women to feel scared. I want them to feel empowered. So how can we make that shift?
Yeah. So
what do we need to know?
What I always like to say is that when you identify that level of feeling scared, is it fear-based or is it you actually being afraid? And so usually most people are like, oh, that's actually fear. And so you get to just take this nice deep breath, because birth is so triggered, right? Like you get to sink into your body and you get to realize that right now in this moment, there's over 8 billion people on the planet. And every single one of those people had to be born.
Yeah. So
birth innately works, right? Like it's something that in order to be alive, you had to be born.
Yes.
So for all of time, birth has worked.
Yeah.
And so
birth works.
Birth works. Birth is as safe as life gets. There's inherent risk with everything that we do, but birth
I love that.
It's literally as safe as life gets. And so we get to sink into the knowing of that. And we get to realize that with everything that has the inherent risk, that we get to go through and say, am I willing to take that risk? What are the actual risks? What are the alternatives? What are the benefits? And then we get to come back to the center, not from a place of fear, but from a place of stillness and a place of trust in trusting our bodies, and realize that we get to make the decision for what's right for us. And we get to make the decision that we choose the care providers that will give us the level of care where there is no fear that we enter into birth with. Because one of the most important things for birth space is when a woman feels safe and feels connected. If those two missing pieces aren't there, then the hormones within our brains don't work the same way.
Oof. Oh my God, it's the same for sex.
Same for sex.
That makes sense too, right?
Right?
You have to feel safe and connected.
Yeah.
Is that connected to orgasmic or ecstatic birth?
It is.
Safe and connected.
It is.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of different ways to look at this. And I don't usually like to use the word orgasmic, because people that have given birth, or people that have seen other people give birth, women give birth, they're like, I never saw anybody have an orgasm. And so we use the word orgasm as connected as ecstatic, right? So I have seen a few people have rolling orgasms during birth, like literally,
fingers crossed, ladies.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
But
the experience of a normal, undisturbed physiological birth is that of ecstasy. It is an ecstatic experience. And everything that I've ever learned about ecstatic birth is from witnessing this happen on a regular basis, but also from one of my friends, Dr. Sarah Buckley, who's an Australian. And she is the expert in all of the different little hormones that interweave together to create this ecstatic experience. And I always look at birth as this portal. It's this portal through this transformation. I actually just did a birth on Friday with a couple that brings groups down to Peru to do ayahuasca ceremonies with the shamans down there. And it was their first birth experience together. She has a couple older kids from a previous relationship. And the first thing that her husband said after the experience was, that was just like sitting in ceremony. That was just like being in ceremony. Yeah. And so that's because of all these hormones. We actually release all of these hormones. The number one thing is oxytocin that's released in birth. And there's a famous obstetrician, Michel Odant, and basically what he says is whatever facet of love that we consider, oxytocin is involved. anything. Sex.
Yes.
Me staring into your beautiful angelic eyes, us having a heart connection, hugging your partner, whatever it is, oxytocin is involved. So oxytocin in this space right now is here and present. And what happens is it's this love hormone that interweaves with the releasing to have contractions. But the other thing that oxytocin does is it creates this ejection reflex. So anything that has ejection, right? So there's a couple different things that happen. So we can go straight to sperm. Like there's ejaculation, like men have to eject sperm out of their bodies in order to conceive a baby. The other piece is there's something that's called a fetal ejection reflex. And the fetal ejection reflex is when baby gets low enough within the pelvis, there's this ability as mom is pushing to literally eject her baby out. And they come out like little rockets. It's the coolest thing ever. And it doesn't happen every time, but there is the ability to have this ejection reflex that happens.
I've seen that online.
Yeah,
it's so wild.
It's so cool. Now, there's also the ejection reflex for the placenta. So commonly what happens in, normal Western birth is that the placenta is what's called the third stage management of the placenta. So the baby comes out. A lot of people don't even know that there's an organ inside of them after the baby, by the way. But what's happened is this organ has created a home for your baby. And so as this, starts, the uterus is nice and big and it starts to contract down after the baby's gone because there's no more space that the baby stretched the uterus out. And the placenta starts to adhere off the uterine wall, which is a survival technique because we need that wound to heal, so to speak. So the uterus continues to contract. In an optimal world, the baby would be on mom's chest and mom would be making eye contact with their baby and, continuing to release all these love hormones.
Makes me emotional.
Yeah. And baby, if you've never seen a breast crawl, it's so important to watch because just like puppies or kittens or any other mammal, they come out with the innate knowing of how to feed. And so they get on mom's chest and their little feet, they're like little like puppies, they're like moving their little feet and they're actually contracting the uterus even more because their feet are in the direct relation to where mom's uterus is. And then they're kind of like bouncing their heads around a little bit, which is then causing that erectile tissue of the nipple to stand up, which then releases more oxytocin. And in this dynamic dance that happens between mom and baby following the birth, the placenta ejection reflex should be there. But in a hospital setting, and sometimes in an out-of-hospital setting, depending on what your midwives do for the management of the placenta, is that they have something called the third stage management of labor. And so they want that placenta out within 10 to 15 minutes. If the placenta is not out within 10 to 15 minutes, they're going in and doing manual removal of the placenta, which involves their hands pulling on this placenta to, yank it out of the woman's body. They're using medications that elicit Pitocin is a synthetic version of oxytocin. So they're, bypassing the body's system and they're giving the Pitocin. Now, I carry Pitocin. I'm not anti-Pitocin. If I have a mom that is bleeding, I will use it, no problem. But once we allow that process to happen, that natural loop of the breast crawl and all of that, then we see such a dramatic decrease in any sort of postpartum hemorrhage. And if we let those oxytocin levels rise naturally on their own, it's the highest that they'll ever be, unless, whatever it is, how many babies you have. But at that point, every baby that you have, it's the highest that it will ever be in your entire life, because that's the bonding hormone. That's the hormone where you fall deeply in love with your baby. And it initiates within you this like mama bear where you're like, oh my gosh, in this moment, I already knew that I love my baby. I could feel my baby moving inside of me and we had this connection in utero. But in this moment, I would die for this baby and I would do anything for this baby's safety. And I've never loved anything as much as this baby in this moment. And so it's all there for a reason. Like it's all there for a reason. And then we bring in all the endorphins and the beta endorphins. And those are the hormones that initiate this sense of transcendence and this sense of euphoria and this sense of having this altered state of consciousness experience in that moment. And it's so beautiful. So that is ecstatic birth. That is the body's innate system working. So we have these imprints that carry us throughout our life, the rest of our life, in the knowing of A, how important love is, but B, how strong moms are in that experience. And when they are aware of the strength that they bring throughout that experience, throughout the rest of their life, they enter into motherhood knowing that they can do anything.
Oh my God, I'm so emotional. I'm just like, whoa, so beautiful. It just makes me think of one of these birth videos that I watched, a woman in a home birth in a birthing tub, and she's like crowning and she's on all fours. Oh my God, I'm going to get so emotional.
God, I love emotion.
Her husband is like, or her partner has his head to her forehead. And his face is just one of like such empathy because there's nothing he can do except for hold space for her. So he's just with her. And she's like roaring. And he's just like holding the intensity while she's like, like roaring this kid into the world. And I don't know why, but that imprinted me. I watched a lot of birth videos. But that, I just fucking bawled my eyes out because I was like, wow, that's powerful. Like, whoa, for a man, speaking of being the protector, to just hold, there's nothing he can do other than love you in that moment and not back away from the intensity. And I think for any woman, it's like one of our teachers said when Patrick and I were in practice the other day, he's like, you know, for a man to complete is for it to end. And for a woman, for something to be fixed, he said, fixed. For a man, if something to be fixed means for it to end. For a woman, oftentimes, and this is a generalization, but it felt true for us, to be fixed means to be fully seen while you're fully expressed. And he's like, and both are true because if you are fully seen while fully expressing, it ends. So just that witnessing of this woman in the fullest moment of intensity, the baby's crowning through her. She like that I imagine is the most intensity a woman will ever experience in her life. And to have her partner right fucking there and like, I'm not going anywhere and I'm not backing away. I'm not trying to make it end. I'm just going to witness you in this intensity. And there was just something about that energetic that I was like, so moved by. And just, hearing you talk about this beautiful process. What I don't want is for any woman listening who didn't have a home birth or didn't have the birth that she wanted to feel bad or inferior. And so is there anything that you could say to mamas who are listening that might be feeling that way?
Yeah, there's zero shame in this conversation. This conversation is purely a heart-centered conversation. So I always feel that same way too, because obviously what I talk about is home birth because I'm a home birth midwife and it's what I'm passionate about. And what I always come back to saying is, I don't give a crap if you give birth like outside in the middle of a stream underneath the stars, or if you schedule your C-section. The most important piece of this equation is that you felt empowered, that you felt held, that you felt seen, and that everything that you needed, you were listened to. And I recently just told a story about a birth that I was at, and she had planned a home birth. And I can bring in this whole nother loop right here, but what we know is about 1 in 3 women are sexually abused and throughout the world. I shouldn't even say our culture. And that usually comes up during birth because you lose control of those sexual organs. Like there's something that like actually like doesn't turn off. Your body is moving through this energy that you can't be like, okay, turn that off now, I'm done. And it's the same thing that usually women find themselves in with sexual abuse. And so I am very in tune with women, and I go through it throughout the prenatal period. And sometimes women, it's subconscious, like they don't even know that there was sexual abuse. And sometimes it comes up in birth. And so this woman had disclosed to me her sexual abuse, and she had a very extensive history of the sexual abuse. And it was when she was younger, and I could start to tell by the sounds of her voice in labor what age she was at, because her voice sounded like that age that she was sexually abused at. And in the middle of that experience, it was really hard. It was really hard to hold space. It was really hard to witness. And it was something that she had to be in her vulnerability, and I couldn't rescue her from anything. And she looked at me and she stared deep into my soul. And she said, I want a C-section. She had already had a vaginal birth, and this birth was working. Okay. Her first vaginal birth, she was numb for. So it was a completely different experience of intensity. And I said, what did you just say? And she said, I want a C-section. And so in that moment, I questioned nothing. I said, let's go to the hospital and have a C-section. And I had called ahead and I spoke to the OB and I told her the situation that was happening. And I explained the sexual abuse. And I said, I'm coming in for a C-section. There is no medical indication for this. This mom needs to reclaim the authority of her body in this moment. And thank God on the other end of that phone was an OB that actually understood the incredible intensity and the gift that she would give her in this moment. And we walked in and they had an OR ready and she walked back into that C-section. And that was one of the most empowered births that I have ever witnessed in my career. Now, probably people would never think that. Like if you asked me what's the most empowered birth that you've ever seen, and I said that, most people would be like, what is she talking about? But
I get it.
But it's
really
when you have that full autonomy and full sovereignty over your body and you are making the decisions that are right for you and your baby. So be it a home birth, be it a hospital birth, be it a birth under the stars in the middle of Boulder, Colorado in the mountains, it's what's right for you and your baby in that moment.
Oh my God, I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think what it's highlighting is like women just need to be listened to and supported. And I'm so grateful there are birth workers like you who are just listening and believing women. Like really that's empowering women, giving them the information, like you said, safety and connection. Oh my goddess. But yeah, so beautiful. So I would love to ask some of these questions that my husband has.
Let's go through it. You know what I love so much is when we connected and I'm like, okay, like, is there something specific you want me to talk about? And I sent over some talking points and we're like, we're just going to flow. And it's so beautiful, this conversation that we're having right now. It's just like so authentic and organic. And I'm so grateful to be on this space with you right now.
Oh, thank you for being here, my love. I love that about the feminine within all beings, irrespective of gender, which is like the self-organizing.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, we just flow, we just self-organize. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
So I think you may have answered this, but Patrick's question. So Patrick's first question is, what are the indicators that a home birth is not appropriate as far as like physical indications or medical indications?
So every state is going to be different within their own jurisdiction of licensure for midwives. And the state of California has a certain guidelines for women that can, like, you know, they're allowed to give birth at home. And most of the time they're fully within reason. Like I mentioned a few earlier, like if you have like a crazy cardiac condition or like there's like, you know, liver disease or like hepatitis or you know, like it's stuff that you're like a health problem that you've been dealing with chronically throughout your life. And those are the big ones. Now, with that being said, there is always a little bit of wiggle room if you're providing individualized care. Like obviously the law, like there's some things that are hard no, but when you have midwives that have collaborative care obstetricians that believe in the normal physiological experience and they believe in home birth, then there's opportunities to say like, okay, like this is perfect example. Twins and breaches. So the state of California says that midwives can't provide care and service for women that are having a breech birth, which is where the baby comes butt first or feet first, or twins or multiple, so anything over 2 babies. And that happened in 2014. So the state took that away from us and we're like, but this is still normal. Like this is still a normal variation of birth. And so I closely work with an OB. His name's Dr. Stuart Fishbein. He's Birthing Instincts on Instagram. And he is like, reteach breech. Like breech is not safe to the medical community because we've lost the education behind it. And if we have care providers that have the education and knowledge around it, breech birth is safe. And it's the same thing that goes for twin birth. Like if you are equipped and you know what you're doing with twins, then it is perfectly safe to have twins at home within reason, of course. But if all of those things line up, then great. So I have the ability to work with him in that sense where some of these higher risk situations can be individualized and be a home birth. So it just really has to be this open field of communication that you have with your care provider, but also what the jurisdiction of their licensure states. Because I know that there's some states that breech is allowed. So it really just kind of depends state by state.
Okay, I love that. So his next question is, what is the maximum distance a hospital should be from you if you are having a home birth? He wants the masculine strategic information. So funny.
So that's to be debated. It depends on, so step back prior to the hospital setting. Like hospitals, birth got brought to the hospital, 1950s, about 95% of women gave birth in the hospital. Prior to 1900, everybody was giving birth at home. So if we move out of this blip in time, like the past 70 years is a blip in our evolutionary cycle. Okay. So that means for 70 years, we've had access to hospitals. Before that, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, nobody had access to those hospitals. And so it's one of those things that, yes, now we live in a world where we do have access to these things, and we do have to marry both of these types of levels of medicine that are given. And, for me, it's like a no-brainer. I live in Orange County, California. The furthest away hospital is 10 minutes from me. But I know midwives that work in rural Montana, and they're 4 hours away from a hospital, and they still do home births. And then on the contrary of that is that I know midwives that work in Africa, and sometimes these women ride 10 hours on the back of a motorcycle to get to their facility. And so it's such a Western thought process, because if we kind of take out the convenience of living in a Western world, birth still works, it still works. And so I know where you guys live, and you're well within the limits of a hospital very close to you. And it's just, finding the care provider that works within that system and can guide you through that system if you needed to use it.
Yeah. Because we're 30 minutes, we're up in the mountains, but that's one of his.
30 minutes is not far for me. I mean, I'm 30 minutes in traffic here in Orange County, right?
Yeah. He said, if you've got a home birth and you have a backup hospital, or the hospital that if you have to go to, do you have to do anything in advance to tee them up?
That's a great question. So, it depends. Again, it's going to be different state to state. So I'm going to speak to California with my situation. So in 2014, what the state of California did is they removed the physician supervision clause. So prior to 2014, they said that every midwife had to have a supervising physician. And what ended up happening is that physicians that were supervising midwives lost their malpractice insurance. And so it was actually impossible to have backup physicians. And we were all really grateful that clause got taken out in 2014, and they changed the verbiage to collaborative care physicians. And so for me, the county of Orange County, I could be way south and my collaborative care physician is 45 minutes away, or vice versa. And if I am actually in need of medical services, I'm going to the closest hospital. And so in order to pre-register for a hospital, you have to have a physician at that hospital. And most physicians won't take you if they know that you're having a home birth because of that malpractice insurance clause. And so it's not like they can, I know there's some doctors that do this, but it's very rare that you find a doctor that's yes, go have a home birth. Everything will be great. I'll back you up. Because anything that's written is them acknowledging that they're saying that it's safe. And then, if something were to happen, then they're held liable for that. And so, it really just depends on what the relationship is with the midwives there in the hospital setting. But it's against the law for a hospital not to take you in any sort of an emergency. And childbirth is considered an emergency within that scope of care. So every hospital has to take you. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll be treated with love and respect. There is a lot of animosity towards people that, the animosity is there for people that are choosing home birth. So it just depends on the situation. But in some ways, I feel like it's gotten way better. In some ways, it's gotten way worse. And I don't know if that's just me as a human evolving and not buying into the drama that's created within some of those practices, or if it's just a reflection of what's happening within the healthcare system across the board.
I feel like if I had to get transferred to a hospital in an ideal world, not that would be ideal, but in an ideal world, the midwife and my husband, I would not want any medical staff to talk to me directly.
Yeah.
I'd be like,
yeah, but
is that
they have
allowed?
to. No, they have to talk to you because you're considered their patient. So they, like it depends on what the situation is, but they actually have to get consent from you, which is good. I think that should be the case. But it's one of those situations that I believe every birth is a sacred contract, and every experience that we're shown in our birth experiences is the lessons that need to be learned in order to parent that child. And so in those situations, I feel that mom does receive a different level of experience, and that experience weaves into her sacred contract for parenting them, for mothering that child throughout its life. So it's all part of it. Like it's not, I don't villainize those experiences. I use them as really big teaching points and learning lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine you just have to be prepped how to advocate for yourself.
Now, it's so interesting because with COVID, like I wasn't allowed in the hospital from 2020 to 2022. And so anytime, which is rare, like I rarely have to transfer to the hospital, but like anytime I had to send someone to the hospital, it was like, I'm sending them to like a pack of wolves. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what's waiting for them on the other end of that. And so that's when like FaceTime became like a really beautiful thing. And so I was able to still be an advocate, not physically there, but I was able to still be there, FaceTime wise, and go over any questions they had with what the staff was asking them.
Oh my gosh, thank God.
Yeah.
Thank God. May everyone be blessed with an angel like you who can help them. So, next Patrick question. If you, what preparatory steps to take planning your plan B? I think we just went through that kind of, but what are the most common things that go wrong during home birth?
Another great question. So a lot of the time, what people don't realize is that any sort of emergency that can happen, midwives are trained in. So most of the time, we don't even have to transfer in for those certain situations. I'll narrow in on a couple. So the first thing for first-time moms is exhaustion. That's like the biggest reason I transfer first-time moms in. And it's because it's the first time you're doing this. You're super exciting. You've never experienced this before. And like you are awaiting this baby. And so, contractions start, super early labor. And what I see, not all first time moms, but a lot of first time moms is like, oh my gosh, I'm in labor. I'm so excited. I can't sleep. And then like 2 days later, active labor kicks in and they've been up for 2 nights. And then at that point, they're just exhausted. And so I've definitely had my fair share of first-time moms transferring in for an epidural to then in turn help them sleep. And then they end up with vaginal birth. But it's not my most favorite thing to do. I'm such like, go to bed. You know what I mean? Like if you think you're in labor, go to bed. Just try to rest as much as you can. It's such an important piece to that. Another reason that we transfer in can be like respiratory distress for babies. So with that being said, midwives, and I'm speaking to myself, not all of us are trained the same, but midwives are trained in neonatal resuscitation. So I have to recertify every 2 years based on what the American Academy of Pediatrics and the it's like I think it's American Heart Association. They come up with these new guidelines. And every 2 years we go through it. I bring all resuscitation equipment into the house, including an oxygen tank. And if there is some sort of reason that baby needs to have a little extra assistance at birth, most of the time it's fine. We do it at the birth and baby comes around just fine. A lot of people talk about APGAR scores. An APGAR score is something that's given to a baby at 1 minute and 5 minutes after birth. And this is kind of like their like report card for how they're doing after birth. And what people don't realize is that it's given at a minute so that baby can have that natural pause and that innate transition from their fluid-filled, ethereal earth or womb body into their earth body. And so we give them that minute of transition time and we let them come into their bodies. If we need to provide any sort of resuscitation outside of that 5 to 10 minute range, then we usually will transfer into a hospital setting to make sure that there's not anything that like like we couldn't see without a chest x-ray or an echocardiogram or something like that, like some sort of cardiac condition. But that's usually just the case, like for observation, like we're going in just to make sure that we're not, missing something that's there for baby, because a full-term healthy baby should come out vigorous and healthy and breathing. Another one that is a potential for transferring to the hospital, again, I know it varies state to state because different states can have different sorts of medication that we give at home. But in the state of California, I can give anti-hemorrhagic medication, the same that they have at the hospital setting. So if a woman is hemorrhaging, then usually I have all of the things I need at home to stop that and not need to facilitate a hospital experience or transfer. But I know that there are states that that's not the case, and they're not allowed to carry certain types of medication. So that will vary state to state, but most of those emergency situations can be handled at home before we have to transfer in.
Amazing. And how many, what percentage of births, or how many out of 100 would you say have to transfer?
So I have to do state stats every year. And typically my stats for first-time moms is usually about 4 to 5% of them transfer into the hospital, and non-emergency, like they're going in for pain relief because they're exhausted. At any given year, most years, I don't have emergency, I'm knocking on wood right now, emergency transfers. It's less than 1% for sure for emergency transfers. And then my C-section rate varies anywhere from 2 to 5% on any given year.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's very low.
It's very low. But I have low risk women. So I always say I have the cream of the crop. They're coming in healthy. They're low risk. We enter through this pregnancy throughout that low risk manner, and they're going into the birth process low risk and healthy as well.
Yeah, I imagine that makes a big difference.
Yeah, huge.
If you're an extra cautious type of person.
I love your husband. He sounds so cute. My husband is British too. So it's so funny to
really?
Yeah. Brits are a special breed.
The cultural quirks.
Yes.
Oh my God, bless him. I love him so much. If you're an extra cautious type of person, what type of people should be present at the home birth? He's do I need to hire an obstetrician? Do I need to have an emergency whoever? Who has to be there?
So I'm going to take you through just a quick visualization. So just imagine right now, if you've ever maybe personally seen any sort of mammal give birth, or even if you've seen it on Instagram, usually what happens is once the house has gotten still in the middle of the night, and if there's other children in the house, the other children are asleep, and it's just in that moment of stillness when our hormone levels start to go up. And it's the same as sex. It's not like you would be having sex in the middle of a busy day with a bunch of people coming in and out of your house. And the same thing as if you're going to have a bowel movement. It's, you would literally do that when the house is still. So just imagine this little mama kitty that's just full of life. And she retreats back usually into the corner of a closet or underneath a bed. And then the family wakes up in the morning and there's kittens. And so what we know about this safety connection that has to be present for a woman to have a normal physiological birth is that if people are observing her and they're staring at her, that it takes away from that level of, and same, think about having an orgasm with 10 people staring at you, right? It's the same thing. So it needs to be in this space where everything is just totally quiet and unobserved. And so there's been so many situations where I've literally pulled a mom back into the corner of a closet and been you need to just go cuddle with your husband. I can hear you if you holler for me, go and have that experience. And on the flip side, I have had people that have hired OBs, and I'm it's great if we need them. If I need to call them, then they can be there, but they don't need to be here for a normal experience. And I remember one of the dads, he looked at me and he was like, "We don't need to call that doctor, do we?" And I was like, "Nope." And not because I didn't love that doctor, but we just didn't need an extra body in that space. And so, for someone like you guys, where, you would, I'm assuming would be hiring a midwife and somebody that you really trust to bring into your space, then they're equipped with knowing when they need an extra layer or level of care to call that in and facilitate that in a manner where you guys are making that decision together and you're still feeling empowered. But it's not like you need an ambulance sitting outside or waiting, anything like that. Like,
yeah, it's like he wants to bring the hospital setting to the home. I'm like, baby, that kind of defeats the purpose.
It does. But like, the equipment that I bring into a home birth is very similar to that of a standard labor and delivery room. I have all the anti-hemorrhagic medication. I have all the resuscitation equipment. If you tear, I can stitch you at home. I have the lidocaine that I bring in to numb. Like, so much of that comes in, and midwives are that safeguard for that normal process at home. Most of the time it's an experienced midwife that's done it hundreds, if not thousands of times. And you get to trust her level of expertise, but you get to come back to knowing that, like, if you start thinking that something's wrong, then we get to tune into that and see if it's a fear or if it's something that the baby's actually communicating to you. And those things are like, okay, let's go to the hospital. It's not about home birth. It's about keeping this safe space and connected.
My gosh, I love this so much. I feel like we're going to have to do a part 2.
I love it. I know we're going over right now.
There's just so much here. Well, if people really connected with you today, as I'm sure they have, where can they connect more with you and your work?
So the best way to find me is through my website, which is theremembering.co. I have a bunch of online courses that I'm recording right now, and I'm in the process of recording some affirmations. So that's the best way to find me there. And then always on Instagram, which most of the time I'm shadow banned. So you have to spell out my full name, which is Lindsey Meehlies, and Meehlies is spelled funny. So just look it up on the podcast for how it's spelled, but you can find me there for sure.
I know, it's like if a woman is trying to be silenced, I really, really want to hear what she has to say personally.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Oh my God, this world we live in. Thank you so much
so
for the work that you do.
You're such a beautiful human. I'm so grateful to be in this space with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, such a blessing. I hope more soon. And for those listening, you heard it here. Run, Don't Walk, Instagram, website. Go connect with this wonderful woman and her work and share this podcast. Maybe you have a friend who's pregnant or thinking about conceiving. Maybe you want to share it with your husband, anyone you think might benefit from this work. And we'll see you very soon.